what is a national park but only one continuum on the conservation perspective?
Hi, and welcome to the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative's 2021 virtual Jackson Hole Wildlife Symposium. As part of the symposium, we will be hosting a series of keynote conversations with some of the top thinkers and leaders of human-wildlife coexistence here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Today's conversation features Gary Tabor. Gary is the founder and president of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation based in Bozeman, Montana. He draws on over 30 years of experience in Africa, South America, Australia, and Canada to promote landscape scale conservation efforts grounded in science and practice. Gary has been involved with the establishment of protected areas, organizing collaborative management strategies, promoting landscape connectivity, and raising awareness of human-wildlife disease spillover. So I'd like to welcome Gary today, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. I'm a big fan, and it's always a pleasure to talk with my friends around the ecosystem.
So we'll just dive in here. What are the current human-wildlife challenges you're focusing on? And then to take that a step farther, how has your skill set or background prepared you for that type of work? And then just sort of candidly, what do you care most about in the work that you do?
Well, first of all, how I approach conservation may be a bit different than most people. I approach conservation not necessarily with a nature lens. I approach conservation with a health lens. I really feel that the way we are impacting the planet, people are impacting the planet, is undermining the health of not only nature, but people themselves. Obviously, COVID brings this crystal clear in our lives, but I have thought this for 30 years. So for me, when I look at these issues, it is through a kind of a public health lens. Here's the thing. I feel the problem is fragmentation. This is as we fragment the planet, it's not just losing habitat, it's losing the ability for nature to function. And when we talk about the extinction crisis and everyone's focused on, where we have 1 million species at risk, I feel what's getting lost in that kind of death toll is the fact that it's 1 million species who are not interacting, who are not creating the fertile soil, clean air, clean water, the things that sustain all life on the planet. So connectivity is the focus of my work and has been the focus of my work for about 30 years. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people think of connectivity as just wildlife corridors, and it's more than that. It's about the integrity of landscapes or seascapes by diminishing the impact of fragmentation. So connectivity is the countermeasure to fragmentation. And I look at this not as I just want to get animal to go from A to B, because I know that's the big conversation in the greater Yellowstone. We're all focused on these wildlife migrations, but I think they're just a symbol of the larger issue of why you need to have species movement, species interaction that maintain the ecological functionality of landscapes. And my organization is called the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and it's a rather boring name, but what I'm trying to do is that connectivity is the architecture for large landscapes. In a world that is fragmenting, the only way to achieve integrity of large landscapes is through a connective approach, not only because you're trying to restore the ecology, but also we know that connectivity is one of the few measures or practices we can do to adapt or provide resilience to climate change. When people think, what am I going to do? The Earth, is under this great pressure from climate change. How do I can respond? Connectivity also is the most effective response mechanism to building resilience to the impacts of climate change, because you're giving species and ecological systems the ability to adapt to these changing environmental conditions. So large landscapes are also a purview, not because I want to save nature without people, is that you also have to connect people across large landscapes for this to work. So a lot of our work with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation is not only trying to figure out how to create the policies and practice for supporting, restoring, maintaining ecological connectivity, but it's also how do we work with people across jurisdictions, across cultures, and really build civility in our work for conservation, because there's a metaphor here, and it's a very direct metaphor, is that when you connect nature, you're also connecting people. And it is something, if anyone can look around in the world in a divisive, when you talk about conflict, conflict is a divisive word. Coexistence is the opposite of that. And civility is that element of coexistence that I think connectivity also addresses. So our organization focuses on connectivity because really it is the hub, the bridge for all these kind of issues. And our work is now, although we were born in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, our work, the ideas of our work now transcend boundaries. And if I can say a little bit more, Ben, I don't know. Yeah. So, for instance, why does this transcend boundaries? It's because connectivity is a global problem, not just in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The things that create fragmentation, like roads, and the impacts that we see here, is a global phenomenon. We are asked to provide the science, the policy, to look at how roads impact landscapes. This is a conversation that's happening in all biodiversity areas of the world. So what my organization does in achieving large scale, large landscape conservation to achieve connectivity is to build networks, connective networks of conservation groups and non-conservation groups around landscapes and seascapes around the world. In fact, our name is the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, but we got requests as well, not only from international landscapes, but also from seascape efforts who see that they have to bring diverse partners together to achieve these kind of large scale goals. Greater Yellowstone is famous for the bison who can't migrate. It is bison trapped by the national park versus being totally protected by the national park. The park should be the core, should be the source area that feeds the full extent of the range of bison.
And it's like a large landscape actually implies fluidity within the landscape, not just that it's
exactly. Yeah, that's the kind of concept we're trying to, we're all stuck on boundaries. We're all stuck on the box of the Yellowstone National Park, but without forgetting that nature is a fluid, dynamic process. The environment is responsive to all these interactions of all these species that literally create the conditions for life, for all life on the planet. I know we always talk human-wildlife coexistence, but really aren't we talking about human-to-human coexistence? And wildlife is really the byproduct, of human-to-human coexistence. And so, my vision is that you can create, you don't have to bring everyone together. The GYCC, the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, just does it for the agency folks. I applaud them for what they've done since 1964 when they were, created. But it is time for that community to open up and have a broader discussion with agencies and other stakeholders. The agencies can't solve this by themselves. They need a broader discussion. They have to be tolerant of these other voices, but we don't have that kind of vehicle right now. In 1872, the national park idea, we all know it started with Yosemite as a state park in 1864 with Lincoln, but okay, the national park with Yellowstone in 1872, that gave birth to the national park movement. Save a pattern, you save nature. Well, we know parks aren't big enough to save nature. In the 20th century, the whole concept of ecosystems. Let's expand the polygon to surrounding areas. Maybe that is the size to save nature. Well, frankly, the people who study planetary thresholds say, no, that's not enough, because species have to move beyond these boundaries. Nature works and functions and interacts beyond those boundaries. So we're in an era in the 21st century I call process conservation. We have to save those ecological processes that support the underpinnings of nature, whether it's migration, whether it's hydrology, whether it's natural disturbance, whether it's pollination. These are the actions that actually make nature work, and that also makes nature work for people. When you start thinking that all land and seas have conservation value, what is a national park but only one continuum on the conservation perspective? Is that not all nature just happens to have to happen in a national park. It has to happen everywhere. National parks play a important source or refuge for nature, but we have to have people really embrace that all their lands, the private lands, have a conservation value. We somehow disregard that conservation can happen in other places besides a protected area. And if we stop, and that's fragmenting thinking. We have to stop that kind of fragmented thinking. So what it also means is that we have to support private landowners, working landowners, who really do have to take care of land and fresh water, that they are conservationists, and we have to affirm them more.
Yeah, it seems to me like the story that we've told about who is a conservationist, and especially in the GYE, is reserved to the nonprofits like ourselves. Like that's what conservation is.
Pay me and I'll do your conservation for you. That's not the way it works, folks.
Do you think with sort of the current sort of 30 by 30 movement that we're moving back towards sort of a model of protected area landscape, that's how we're going to approach conservation?
30 by 30 is arbitrary. It's just using a meme that we have to act fast, quicker, better, in the next 8.5 years by 2030. And that's only because the alarm bells are sounding that, hey, nature's at risk. It's undermining the biosphere. It's undermining the economies of nations around the globe. And you haven't seen anything if you didn't pay attention to why this Syrian civil war erupted over land degradation. If you weren't paying attention and just, the headlines of all the strife there, but not the underlying cause, you missed it, because that is what's going to go on if we don't get ahead of this biodiversity crisis. That's
well said. And I thank you so much, Gary, for being here and for providing this this wealth of experience and knowledge. My last question is just, what do you think is working well with your current work? What are you hopeful or positive about what you're doing right now? And then anything else you'd like the audience to be left with?
Well, I'm hopeful that I really do believe that humanity can come together. I think there is a force for civility. I think connectivity, is that force. I think, I really feel that we can get to human coexistence. I believe, and this is my theory of change, why we work at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, is that this kind of work is under the radar screen. There are 400 and some large landscape collaboratives that are grassroots, working all across our nation. And they all have one thing in common: is they don't talk to each other. They all look at these landscapes focused inward. And this is mirrored internationally. This kind of response is growing rapidly. Why? Because people are starting to see the impacts of climate change and the cumulative effects of habitat loss that is at scale. And they realize that the way they do work is beyond their jurisdictions, beyond their budgets, beyond their human capacity. So they have to figure out ways to work together when even their federal or local governments have little resources to help them. They still need to figure out what to do with invasive species and fire management and drought and wildlife conflict and maintaining the soils and natural infrastructures that sustain the landscapes or seascapes they live in. So my future is that there won't be a top-down response. And my hope is that these landscape efforts will start to coalesce and support each other, learn from each other, and build a constituency for change. Life survives because it's an interactive force. Mm. And once we understand that kind of dynamic, that happens between, all life and the earth, but it also happens between people. So connectivity is the medium for interaction. And let's just manage it in the way that that sustains all life on the planet, including our own. I want to thank NRCC, for always having an eye to the ecosystem. These kind of conversations are too few, and I hope that our conversation today can inspire this roundtable concept. Let's get together, folks. It's been too long that we've had this kind of fragmented dialogue in this ecosystem. If Yellowstone National Park is turning 150, maybe in the 151st year, we can have a full ecosystem level conversation.
That's a hopeful call to action.